Jonathan McIntosh holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of Dallas. His talk tonight is titled Minding Your Own Business, a Libertarian Reading of Plato's Republic, Books 1 and 2.
Without question, Plato's Republic ranks among the greatest of the great works of Western civilization. The central topic of this fictional dialogue of Plato's Republic, this fictional dialogue between Socrates and his friends, justice, by itself is enough to qualify the Republic, as a work of universal human interest. Because, however, one of the principal claims of the Republic is that justice is not merely something good for its effects, but is a good in and of itself, and so must be understood in relation to human nature, which is in its turn only understandable in relation to all of reality. The range of questions posed in the dialogue end up being truly staggering in their scope. What is the structure of fundamental reality? Right? That's the metaphysical question. How is true knowledge possible? Epistemology. What is the basic constitution of the human soul? Anthropology and psychology. What is the nature of the gods or the divine? Theology. What is virtue? Ethics. And what is the best form of civil government? And why isn't it democracy? Politics. These are all questions that Plato's considering in the Republic, and these simply are the most important questions the human mind can pose, such that a Christian can scarcely call themselves educated if they've not wrestled with Plato over these questions. If you've not yet read Plato's Republic, you need to drop whatever comparatively inconsequential book you are currently reading and pick up the Republic. If you have read the Republic, you should be asking yourself when you're going to read it again. This evening, my task is not, fortunately, to consider Plato's Republic as a whole, but to consider just the first 2 of its 10 books, and to do so from a specifically libertarian perspective. As a classic, the Republic is a truly universal work that contains something for everyone. I'm interested in the admittedly limited, but still, I think, worthwhile question of what its opening 2 books hold of particular interest for the libertarian. Now, at this point, let me briefly remind my audience what I mean, what I don't mean by libertarianism. As I'm using the term, libertarianism is the application of the political ethical principle that the moral use of coercion by an individual or by a society or by that society's government, their moral use of coercion is limited to the prevention and punishment of acts of aggression, i.e. violence, theft, or contract violation. Put differently, libertarianism is the attempt to consistently apply the classical liberal idea that political societies, in their specifically political, which is to say coercive dimension, political societies are formed and their civil governments are created not to make men good, as noble and important as that is, but they are created rather to protect natural rights. And for my attempt at giving a natural law defense of libertarian principle, the libertarian principle of non-aggression, see my lecture on this topic in the George Buchanan Forum archives online. Well, with that definition of libertarianism in hand, let us turn to Plato's Republic. The Republic, as I say, is a fictional dialogue staged by Plato between Socrates and a cadre of Socrates' friends and acquaintances. The dialogue opens with Socrates and his young companion, Glaucon, who was one of Plato's older brothers. But the dialogue opens with Socrates and his young companion, Glaucon, making a return journey from the Piraeus, which was the port of Athens, and they're heading back. It's about a 6-mile journey back to the city of Athens proper. On their way back to the city, Socrates and Glaucon are detained by their friend Polemarchus and his gang, and they're taken back to Polemarchus' house. There, Socrates gets into a conversation with Polemarchus' father, Cephalus, and they get into a conversation over the nature of justice. After a couple of different definitions of justice are offered and weighed and found wanting, the sophist Thrasymachus, he interjects himself by defining justice as nothing more than the advantage of the stronger. Justice is the advantage of the stronger. Justice, in short, is a polite word for what is otherwise an impolite but inescapable fact that those in power do what is good for themselves, and then they call that justice. And the rest of Book 1, there's 10 books in the Republic, but the rest of Book 1 it follows Socrates as he attempts to show the incoherence of Thrasymachus' definition of justice and arguing that whatever justice is, it's something healthy, something good, and it's advantageous to both the person who practices it and the people that they practice it upon. Book 2, however, opens with Glaucon, right? Plato's older brother, big bro. He's dissatisfied with Socrates' response. While Socrates may have refuted and silenced Thrasymachus in Book 1, Socrates hasn't yet defined what justice precisely is. Glaucon thus sets out to revive and steelman Thrasymachus' definition. In devil's advocate fashion, Glaucon argues that for most people, justice is merely a compromise or middle road between doing that which is in one's own greatest advantage, namely inflicting injustice on others, and doing that which is in one's least advantage, namely suffering injustice at the hands of others. Justice is just a middle road between the best thing, which is imposing injustice on others, and the worst thing, suffering injustice at the hands of others. Justice is just the compromise that we make. Glaucon demands accordingly that Socrates not only show that justice is something good, but that it is something good in itself and worth having, even if one were to enjoy none of its reputational effects of being just. Socrates accepts Glaucon's challenge and begins by suggesting if they want to know what justice is at the micro level of the soul, right, what does justice do to the soul that has justice? If they want to know what justice looks like in the soul, they might find it helpful first to identify justice on the macro level, namely of a whole city full of souls. Thus commences Plato's famous city-soul analogy, with the remainder of the Book 2 being devoted to the early stages of Socrates' account of his ideal city. He's going to construct over much of the rest of the Republic this account of the ideal city, and he's trying to construct this ideal city in speech, in thought, as a way of giving us a picture of justice in the soul. In Socrates, he gives this account of the ideal city, and he traces its origins in Book 2, from an initially basic community of exchange into a more complex community ruled and protected by an elite guardian class. Book 2 ends with Socrates introducing the education that this special guardian class is going to need to be subjected to, especially in matters of music and poetry, if the guardians are to properly do their job as guardians. Much of the remaining books of the Republic, as I say, are finally devoted to fleshing out the education and lifestyle of the guardians, and doing so at great length. Well, with this summary of Books 1 and 2 of the Republic in hand, I want to undertake a consideration of a handful of passages that I think are of particular interest to and are suggestive for libertarians, and even non-libertarians who should be thinking of, in their own consideration of libertarian values and issues. The first passage occurs that I want to look at on nearly the opening page of the Republic, where Socrates and Glaucon, again, they're making the return journey from the Piraeus to the city of Athens proper. And when they are interrupted by Polemarchus and his gang, it's really a brilliant scene that Plato crafts here. Platonic dialogues aren't just simply a ham-fisted way of just breaking up the ideas and breaking up the monotony. The dialogues are dramatic. There's a story that Plato's telling with these dialogues, and the way he casts the scenes are important. And it's true here. Now, while this scene, right, so Socrates and Glaucon, they're heading back to the city, right? And there's lots of symbology there we could talk about, right? The whole one of the famous pictures in the Republic is the famous allegory of the cave and escaping the cave. Well, they're down in the Piraeus worshiping Bendis, this goddess, and they're ascending up to the city. These are all things that I think Plato's doing here. But anyway, while the scene where they're heading up back to the city, they're detained by Polemarchus and their gang. The whole scene is playful and good-humored. Socrates is among friends, after all. Plato nevertheless crafts this scene in such a way as to raise a rather serious point. When Socrates confirms to Polemarchus that he and Glaucon are indeed heading back to the city, Polemarchus, a character who in real life would later fight and die as a defender of Athenian democracy, and he would die in the Piraeus, trying to restore Athenian democracy after oligarchic rule had been established during the Peloponnesian War. So this is Polemarchus's future, the real-life Polemarchus, who's this character in Socrates' in Plato's dialogue. Polemarchus asked Socrates, "Do you see how many we are, Socrates? You count how many we are here? Well, then you must either prove stronger than we, or you will have to stay here with us." If Polemarchus represents democracy, the question we might see Plato touching on here is whether democracy really in fact represents a true equality of freedom, or whether what it really amounts to is little more than the tyrannical principle of might makes right, where the might in question just happens in this case to take the form of majority or mob rule. As Socrates will argue much later in the dialogue, democracy as a political system is in reality just one stage above, and thus already on its way and devolving into outright tyranny. In having the democratic Polemarchus threaten to violently seize Socrates, accordingly, Plato may be seen putting on trial in advance the democratic city of Athens for when she herself would literally seize, try, and execute Socrates. Through Polemarchus, in other words, Plato makes his very first indictment of democracy and its pretensions to being the supposed great alternative and solution to tyranny, exposing it as often little more than a special form of tyranny, namely the disordered tyranny of the majority. Perhaps it is also Plato's way of warning that there is a little bit of a tyrant in even the most well-intentioned among us. If so, then before Thrasymachus even gets his chance to define justice as the advantage of the stronger, Plato's already raised, literally on the opening page of the Republic, the specter of Thrasymachus justice, which Socrates will spend most of the book 1 deconstructing, and to which he will spend the rest of the Republic constructing a positive alternative. If Polemarchus represents the spirit of coercive might makes right and democratic majoritarian rule, what Socrates counters with in this same scene is the principle of peaceful persuasion. To Polemarchus's challenge that Socrates must either prove more powerful than his gang or else be forced to go with them, Socrates notes that there is a third option, which is that he, Socrates, might persuade Polemarchus to let him and Glaucon go. To Polemarchus's threat of force, accordingly, Socrates responds with the alternatives of reason and rhetoric. Here we have a confrontation of the two basic ways in which human beings are able to move each other to action. They can either induce each other to act by purely external and physical force, by threatening either the person or property of the individual being so moved, or they may induce each other to act by an internal and psychological motive, by giving them sufficient reasons to act on their own behalf. Well, to Socrates' counter-proposal that he might persuade Polemarchus to let him go, Polemarchus rejoins with a statement that strikes at the possibility of any society based on persuasion. But could you persuade us, Socrates, if we won't listen? Glaucon answers for all of us when he says, certainly not. Just leave you to think about that. That's just the first page of the Republic. If you've read it, you need to read it again. For our next passage, we skip ahead in Book 1 to Socrates' refutation of Thrasymachus' definition of justice as the advantage of the stronger. Instructively, much of Socrates' argument lies in a careful reflection on the motives and the incentives that rulers have to rule and that subjects have in being willing to be ruled. In a word, in order to understand what justice in ruling is, Socrates sets out to examine, arguably in a more careful fashion than Thrasymachus does, the praxeology, or the underlying principles of human action that lie behind political rule. As Socrates points out, quote, no one in any position of rule, insofar as he is a ruler, seeks or orders what is advantageous to himself, but what is advantageous to his subjects, the ones of whom he is himself the craftsman. It is to his subjects that what is advantageous and proper to them, that he looks, and everything he says and does, he says and does for them. End quote. So when rulers rule, they rule for the sake of the thing that is ruled. This is why these orders of rule are set up in the first place. This altruistic character of true rule, of course, prompts the question of what it is that those who do the ruling get out of this. If they're ruling for the benefit of others, why would they do that? Okay, so Thrasymachus is wrong. They're not ruling for their own advantage, but they rule for the advantage of others, but still raises the question, why do they do that? What is their motive or incentive, in other words, for ruling for other people's benefit? Socrates' answer is that what they ask for and what they in fact get in return is payment for their trouble. As Socrates at least represents it here in Book 1, at the heart of the political relationship between ruler and ruled is an economic act of exchange. The ruler rules for the benefit of the ruled, for which he is paid for his pains. Socrates' initial refutation of Thrasymachus, then, is deeply fascinating, deeply revealing. It involves a highly praxeological and even economic approach to the whole question of rule, where Thrasymachus smugly acts as though he's somehow uncovered the underlying psychology and praxeology of political rule. Men rule so that they can take advantage of others. Ooh, Very good, Thrasymachus. Socrates exposes Thrasymachus' pretense to realism and worldly wisdom for the sham reasoning that it really is. It doesn't explain why the ruled would ever go along with such an arrangement in the first place, what their motives are, and what it is that they, at least ideally, are hoping to get out of the relationship, even if it should sometimes or often fail to deliver in actual practice. Thrasymachus thinks he has explained justice by exposing its underlying economics, its underlying incentive structure, but it turns out that Socrates is simply the better economist, a better scientist of human action. But one of the takeaways is that here, at least, Socrates, again, does use economics to understand politics. The political relationship is an economic relationship of exchange, even an implicit contract with the political ruler offering his service of rule and his subjects offering him a wage in return. Socrates' economic approach to an analysis of politics continues in Book 2, in Socrates' origin story of the just city. The topic he introduces once again in response to Glaucon's demand that Socrates show what justice looks like in the soul. Tellingly, in developing his city-soul analogy for illustrating justice, Socrates doesn't begin with an already formed city, but he proposes that they construct in theory a new city from scratch, from its founding. As Socrates puts it, quote, if we could watch a city coming to be in theory, wouldn't we also see its justice coming to be? These words are very illuminating. For Socrates, not only do we find justice in the soul by looking for it in the city, but to find justice in the city, we find it specifically by looking for justice in the founding of the city, in how the city comes into being, why people form cities in the first place. After John Locke, wouldn't be a Buchanan talk from me if I didn't mention Saint Locke. Locke's got his problems. His political philosophy isn't one of them. After John Locke, it has been highly fashionable for communitarians, including many conservatives, to dismiss out of hand as artificial or unnatural all political reasoning or methodologies that do not take the political community as an already given fact. Yet Socrates, I would say, is clearly functioning here as a kind of early state of nature theorist. If you want more on that, go see my other George Buchanan talk on state of nature theories. Socrates functions here clearly as a kind of early state of nature theorist, with his suggestion that if we want to understand the political relationship, we need to rationally reconstruct the city's origins and watch it come into being. Aristotle, by the way, makes, I think, a closely related point at the beginning of his Politics. Similar to his analysis of political rule, if we want to understand the political community, we need for Socrates to understand the motives and principles of human action that drive people to form such communities in the first place. So what is the origin of the city then? Once again, it's economic in nature. Socrates explains, quote, I think a city comes to be because none of us is self-sufficient, but we all need many things. And because people need many things, and because one person call on a second, one out of need, and on a third out of a different need, many people gather in a single place to live together as partners and helpers. And such a settlement is called a city. Isn't that so? The response he gets is, it is, end quote. The origin and identity of the city, according to Socrates, is economic need. Human beings are not sufficient to provide themselves with everything that they need to live, and so they compensate for their lack by means of exchange with others. Now, Socrates, of course, does not deny here that there are other, even higher order, more important even, common goods, such as virtue, human flourishing, the worship of God, around which individuals might organize and form communities. Doesn't deny any of that. But what he says is that the origin of the city, that is the political community, lies in economic need of human beings trading what they own or possess but don't need, or at least need less, for those things that other people own or possess and which they need or want more than what they have. Not only is this the origins of the city, but as we may recall, Socrates had also said that in the origins of the city we also find the meaning of justice. Does Socrates make good on this claim? Unfortunately, I don't think he does. Yet even his failure here is highly revealing. In his summary statement of the economics involved in the founding of the city, Socrates articulates one of, if not the earliest formulations of the principle of the division of labor. Men are most productive when they specialize and divide their labor by not trying to produce not trying to produce everything that they or others might need, but by specializing and producing only one thing or a few things. From this entirely valid principle of the division of labor, however, which is where the true principle, I think, upon which Socrates constructs the city, Socrates immediately goes on to infer a quite different and I think entirely specious principle that he's ultimately going to credit with the founding of the city and the nature of justice. But I think it's just that's not actually the way his own argument works. And what he goes on to infer from the principle, the valid principle of division of labor, is what is commonly referred to as Socrates' principle of specialization. Listen to what Socrates says. So he's going to make this statement. He thinks this follows from his earlier principle that men are most productive when they focus on a few things. He says, "We aren't all born alike, but each of us differs somewhat in nature from the others. We differ in nature from each other, one being suited to one task, another to another. The result, then, is that more plentiful and better quality goods are more easily produced if each person does one thing for which he is naturally suited, does it at the right time, and is released from having to do any of the others." End quote. According to Socrates, then, from the fact that the city comes into being from individuals tending to specialize in the production of certain goods or services and then exchanging those goods and services which they do specialize in for those goods or services which they don't specialize in, according to Socrates, we infer the principle that everyone therefore has a nature that uniquely suits them to a particular line of production, and that everyone therefore everyone ought to specialize in producing that good or service which their nature most suits them towards. That is Socrates' famous principle of specialization, and this is in fact what Socrates is going to later say is the origin of the city and hence the meaning of justice. Justice in the city just is, according to Socrates, each man doing the job which his nature suits him for, and in that sense, minding his own business. The famous line from Socrates quoted in the title of my paper this evening. This means that if nature suits you to be in the producing class, then you're content to be a producer, and you don't try to usurp the role of the guardian or ruling class. And if your soul nature suits you for guarding or ruling, it means that you do your duty by guarding and ruling, and you don't try to be a producer. Now, the main problem with Socrates' principle of specialization, as I've already indicated, and that hopefully you've noticed, is that it's a conclusion that does not at all follow from its premises. From the premise that the city originates in different men specializing in the production of some things and then trading them for the things whose production other men have specialized in, it does not in the least follow that men therefore have a nature that predisposes them to certain lines of production. Much less does it follow that men therefore have some kind of moral obligation, right? Some therefore legally enforceable, coercively enforceable moral obligation to produce those and only those things that their nature suits them towards. So Socrates' principle of specialization is entirely specious, or more colloquially, it's bogus. And yet the significance of this principle for his entire argument in the Republic would be difficult to overstate. As he said earlier, in the founding of the city, we may locate justice and its meaning, and Socrates will later definitively assert that this principle was the operative motive in the formation of the city, and it's therefore the underlying principle of justice, when the reality is nothing of the sort. The true founding principle, in Socrates' own argument, was the economic principle of a division of labor, which Socrates, by means of a rhetorical sleight of hand, then manipulates into his moral and metaphysical principle of specialization, a principle that I think is in fact false, and which I think we just need to reject as false, just as Christians view the world. This is not how God made us. He did not make us to do one thing and one thing only. Maybe some people, but it's just not generally true. Yet this ingenious yet disingenuous shift from an economic to a moral principle for the founding of the city is absolutely key in explaining how Socrates is eventually going to get us from this proto-liberal, quasi-libertarian, laissez-faire paradise he initially introduces us to, in which, by the way, he himself calls the healthy city, to the totalitarian, communistic, anti-family hellhole that he's going to develop over the course of the following books of the Republic. Now, that's at least reading him on a conventional reading, which I'm not going to get into whether he's being esoteric or whatever in presenting this hellhole, but that's what he gives us. Okay, community of wives and children. If you're not that familiar with the Republic, right? He completely demolishes the traditional family. It's disgusting. It's gross. Maybe he has some higher purpose in that. That's fine. But that's my point is where he starts this one city and gets us to another. How does he get us there? It's this sleight of hand from division of labor, an economic principle, which is valid, to this moral metaphysical principle of principle specialization, which is false and should be rejected. Time prohibits us from considering the many other passages in the opening books of Plato's Republic, to say nothing of the remaining books of the dialogue that are of critical interest from a libertarian perspective. To review what we have seen, the opening movement of the dialogue places us remarkably close to a proto-liberal, even proto-libertarian understanding of political life. Socrates problematizes the alternatives of coercion and persuasion. He represents political rule as a form of service compensated by payment. The city itself is traced back not to the higher order ends of virtue, human flourishing, and religion, as important as those are, but to the prosaic fact of human insufficiency and mutual need. Socrates' initial city is simple, peaceful, based on mutual economic need and exchange, and Socrates explicitly calls this city healthy. Yet it is also here that the dialogue begins to take a disturbing turn, one that will bear bad fruit in the books to follow, at least, again, on a conventional reading of the Republic. What begins as an economic account of cooperation is subtly and surreptitiously transformed into a moral and metaphysical doctrine of fixed social function. The division of labor, which explains how free individuals can mutually benefit one another through exchange, is fallaciously transitioned into a principle of specialization, according to which justice consists in each person doing one and only one thing dictated by his nature, and refraining from all others. In other words, what began as a descriptive account of how people actually coordinate their activities becomes a prescriptive account of what they are morally permitted to be. From a libertarian perspective, this is a crucial sleight of hand. The city does not arise because men know their natures and submit to them, but because, as Friedrich Hayek would remind us, they do not know everything. And in any case, they certainly cannot do everything. The moralization of economic specialization thus marks the point at which freedom quietly gives way to compulsion and persuasion to authority. Once justice is defined as minding one's own business in Socrates' specialized sense, the ground has been laid for the guardians, the censorship, the abolition of the family, and the total subordination of individual choice to political order that will follow in the later books. And since technology and its dangers are a central theme in some of the other papers offered this evening, I thought I'd be annoying, like Socrates, and have AI give me a summary of the significance of my own analysis. Here was ChatGPT doing as good or better of a job as I could summarize my argument, though I admittedly had to make some tweaks, right? The demons behind AI don't get everything right. So here's what AI summarized as my paper with my modifications. This is AI, me plagiarizing AI plagiarizing me. Seen in this light, the opening of the Republic functions almost as a warning. Plato shows us how easily a politics grounded in voluntary cooperation can be reinterpreted as a politics of enforced harmony, how quickly the language of order can displace the reality of liberty, and how seductive it can be to mistake social coordination for moral destiny. The libertarian, then, need not reject Plato outright. He must read him attentively and critically, precisely at the point where decentralized economic order and achievement then becomes an excuse for moralizing and ossifying that order through state enforcement and obedience. In the end, the lessons of Book 1 and 2 may be this: the true alternative to Thrasymachus is not a city in which everyone is assigned their place, but a society in which no one is coerced into it. Justice, properly understood, is not a matter of each man being confined to his role, but of each man being free to choose his own, so long as he does not violently interfere with the equal freedom of others. Plato begins closer to that insight than he is often given credit for. That he ultimately abandons it is precisely what makes the Republic such an enduring and such a dangerous book. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this presentation from the George Buchanan Forum Conference. We have many more that you can check out at our website at tgbf.org. tggbf.org. You can also find us on YouTube or on your favorite podcasting platform. In true free market fashion, we're entirely crowdfunded by the generous support of people like you. If you'd like to help our work, you can set up one-time or recurring donations at tgbf.org. The best way for others to hear about us is from their friends. So please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing our material. We greatly appreciate it.